Manning His Majesty's Navy was always one of the major challenges faced by the Royal Navy. Throughout the 18th century, many sought alternatives to the notorious practice of impressment, wherein press gangs went ashore to forcibly and sometimes violently compel idle seamen to enlist by signing their names in the ship's books. Impressment was widely regarded as undesirable as it strained social relations with the lower classes in British port towns. The unpopularity of impressment is evident in the case of Broadfoot in 1743. Broadfoot, a seaman, shot and killed an unarmed member of a press gang. Although the press gang was acting illegally as noted by the judge due to the absence of their lieutenant, Broadfoot was nonetheless found guilty of manslaughter. There was a public outcry to release the man, who was seen as a defender of liberty. Many magistrates also detested press gangs for their infringements on individual freedoms and even went so far as to arrest and prosecute their members, thereby sparking conflict with the Admiralty. Renowned naval historian Nicholas Roger argues that there was another reason for magistrates to despise the press gangs. In 18th century England, the state was relatively weak in domestic affairs compared to the powerful local authorities. Consequently, press gangs acting in the name of the state were unwelcome guests to local magistrates who viewed their presence as a challenge to their authority. For this reason, some press gangs even sought a warrant from local authorities to operate in their jurisdiction, although this was legally unnecessary, but as Roger notes, it was politically very wise. Many men were pressed at sea by boarding parties as their ships approached British ports. There was no escape for these poor men, but armed resistance was not uncommon. However, when mutiny or any form of desertion occurred, the law stipulated that the sailor's contract would be terminated and that he would forfeit all his wages. This situation encouraged the seamen to accept their fate, as it allowed them to receive their wages before being pressed into service with the Royal Navy. At the same time, merchant ship captains were dissuaded from enforcing discipline, since desertion relieved them of the obligation to pay their seamen's wages, thereby increasing their own profits. Many proposed solutions were quickly dismissed as they were either too costly, something Parliament was keen to avoid, or infringed too heavily on the liberties of Englishmen. This was deemed unacceptable, as liberty and the navy were often closely associated, epitomized by the famous line, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves." The irony was that Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who was in office between 1721 and 1742, made genuine attempts to address the problem, proposing several bills that were quickly rejected for the reasons outlined before. Many parliamentarians chose to ignore the issue altogether, eagerly dismissing any legislation that suggested increased government spending. They operated under the simplistic belief that as Britain was a seafaring nation full of traders, a manning problem was inconceivable. However, if difficulties did arise in finding the right men for the men of war, the opposition conveniently attributed them to Walpole's so-called tyrannical inclinations. Impressment was retained as the perceived lesser evil. To address some of the associated problems, the Admiralty sought to regulate and control the practice more effectively. This effort led to the establishment of the so-called Impress Service, designed to provide the operation with a more legal framework. In 1745, the first regulating captains were appointed. Their role was to ensure that the press gangs followed the rules and that they released individuals who were unjustly pressed, such as non-seamen, seamen already assigned to another ship, or those with valid proof of exemption. The Impress Service was of course far from foolproof, as corruption and favoritism were rampant, particularly during periods of acute manning shortages such as the War of Jenkins' Ear, when disease ravaged the ranks and forced the government to take desperate measures to keep the warships operational. Outward bound shipping was prohibited unless the captain quote-unquote allowed a portion of his seamen to be conscripted into the navy. Nevertheless, impressment remained the primary method of manning the Royal Navy until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing to my Patreon or leaving a donation on Buy Me a Coffee. As you can imagine, preparing and creating these videos takes quite a bit of time, and any support would be greatly appreciated. Also, if you want to read more about British naval history, check out the Heart of Oak website for articles covering diverse periods and aspects of the British Navy, as well as the navies of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand.